Let me do this on a recording. Hang on. Okay. This starts with endocrine system part 1. I'm going to move a little fast through it. Pause for the highlighted sections. Again, the highlighted sections you really should pay attention to. Most of the exam questions come from this highlighted portion, so you might want to make particular attention to that. Again, when we talk about the endocrine system, it includes all the endocrine cells and cells of the body which produce hormones, paracrine factors, and those that have effect beyond tissues of origin. Endocrine cells are basically glandular secretory cells that release secretions into extracellular fluid. Characteristics distinguishes them from other exocrine cells which secrete their products on epithelial cell surfaces. Chemicals released by endocrine cells may affect only adjacent cells, as in the case of most of the paracrine factors, and they may affect cells throughout the body. These are some of the components of the endocrine system: hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid gland, adrenal glands, kidneys, in the digestive tract that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, adipose tissue, heart, pineal glands, all of these areas, pancreatic islet cells, all of these areas of the body are involved in the secretion of hormones. So now hormones can be divided into 3 groups: amino acid derivatives, test question, peptide hormones, and or lipid derivatives. Those are the 3 areas, 3 basic groups where they're chemical structures. Amino acid derivatives are relatively small molecules. They're structurally related to amino acids, and so a lot of the hormones that we talk about are derived from and sometimes are referred to as biogenic amines, especially the catecholamines. Compounds such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, which are similar in structures, are sometimes called the catecholamines. These are important. These are produced in the adrenal glands, and we'll talk about those just a little bit more in the future. Catecholamines such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and or thyroid hormones are synthesized from molecules of the amino acid tyrosine. Another test question for you there. Melatonin is manufactured from the amino acid tryptophan. All of the hormones, as you will see, typically have derivatives, or typically are derivatives of amino acids. There are peptide hormones as well that are arranged in chains of amino acids. Peptide hormones are a large and diverse group. It includes hormones with short polypeptide chains, such as antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, prolactin. These are all groups that are derived from peptide hormones. There are also lipid derivatives as well, steroid hormones, which are derived from cholesterol. Chycinoids basically are derived from arachidonic acid. Steroid hormones specifically are lipids structurally that are similar to cholesterol. As you can see, that's highlighted as well. You'll probably see that information again. Steroid hormones are released by males and females in the reproductive tract. We see androgens being produced in the testes, estrogens, progesterones by the ovaries, adrenal glands, corticosteroids in the kidneys, calcitriol. Steroid hormones, the liver gradually absorbs many of the steroid hormones and converts them to soluble forms that are excreted in the bile and in the urine. Chycinoids I didn't pay a lot of time on, or put a lot of time on, but they're small molecules. 5-carbon ring compounds are important in paracrine factors, coordinate cellular activities, and affect enzymatic processes such as those we see in blood clotting. The chycinoids have secondary roles as hormones, so primarily we don't see them involved. Leukotrienes and prostaglandins are particular categories of these agents. Leukotrienes are released and activated by white blood cells in the system, important in coordinating tissue responses to injury and disease. And then prostaglandins are in most body tissues. Some tissues we see prostaglandins are converted to other substances as well, thromboxanes and prostacyclines. Again, I didn't pay a lot of attention on these agents. Now, we see the secretion and distribution of hormones. Typically, release occurs in capillaries. The release there is abundant. Hormones are quickly entered into the bloodstream and distributed throughout the body. Their duration of action depends on the hormones. Freely circulating hormones remain functionally less than 1 hour, typically sometimes as little as 2 minutes. Just depends on the hormone and the action. They can become inactivated. It diffuses out of the bloodstream and will bind on particular receptors or target cells that have receptors. If you remember back to A&P Part 1, we talked about receptors, protein receptors. on cells that are sensitive to pick up certain chemical agents in the bloodstream. Hormones specifically are what we're talking about here now. It's absorbed, broken down by cells in the livers of the kidneys, as I alluded to earlier, then broken down enzymes in the plasma and interstitial fluid. Now, thyroid and steroid hormones remain in circulation for much longer periods of time. Less than 1% of these hormones will circulate freely. Most of them will bind. At an equilibrium state that exists between free hormones and bound hormones, again, once hormones are secreted from whatever organ they're secreted from, there becomes a point at which all the receptors are bound. When all of the receptors are bound, doesn't matter how much more hormone you secrete into the system, they can't bind to any more receptors. So we'll see quickly that these secreted substances will reach an equilibrium state. That's primarily because the receptor sites become bound. Some mechanisms of action when we look at hormone actions, they have an effect on a target cell. So all of the hormones that we talk about will have a particular area in the body where they will attack and carry out their effect. These particular cells, and for every cell that we're talking about, they have receptors. The presence or absence of specific receptors determines the cell's hormonal sensitivity. For cell receptors that will bind a particular hormone, cells will respond to the hormone's presence. Without receptors, the hormone cannot bind, and thus you will not see an effect on that particular cell. These hormones receptors are typically located on the cell membrane. Sometimes they're located inside the cell, and so the hormone, by one mechanism or another, endocytosis or whatever, would have to be picked up and brought into the cell. Receptors, for example, for catecholamines and acantinoids are on the cell membrane of their respective target cells, but again, we can see that this may change depending on the cell that's involved and that requires a particular hormone to carry out a particular reaction. Now, there are messengers. Any hormone that binds to a receptor in a cell membrane does not have a direct effect on the target cell. The hormone does not begin building a protein or catalyzing a specific reaction. Instead, the hormone acts through a messenger. This is a substance that causes the appearance of a secondary messenger inside the cytoplasm. Your book goes into a little more detail about how these mechanisms work. The secondary messenger is what functions inside the cell as either an enzyme activator and or an inhibitor or a cofactor, with the net result of changing the rate of various metabolic reactions. Secondary messengers include, and again this is another test question or proposed test question, cyclic AMP, which is a derivative of ATP, which you're familiar with from the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, cyclic GMP, which is a derivative of GTP, which is another high energy compound, and then calcium ions, very common secondary messengers that you should be familiar with. Somewhere along this process also is the process of amplification, which is basically a binding of a small number of hormones to a particular membrane or receptor, which leads to the appearance of thousands of secondary messengers, which will help carry on this process. The more secondary messengers that are available, it actually magnifies the effect of the hormone on the particular target cell. For regulation's sake, the presence or absence of hormones can affect the nature or the number of hormone receptors on the protein cell. So if you decrease the number of receptors present, or the cells decrease the number of receptors present, this process is referred to as downregulation, in which the presence of a hormone triggers a decrease in the number of hormone receptors. This is a way that the body in itself is able to regulate the effect of certain hormones on the system. You can also have the opposite of that, which is upregulation, where a particular type of reaction needs to occur from the body, and the number of receptors on the cell membrane may actually increase. Now, G protein, the link between the first messenger and the second messenger generally involves a G protein, which is an enzyme complex that's coupled to the membrane receptor. G protein refers to the fact that the proteins have to bind GTP. Again, this is a high energy source that we see in this process. Your book has a nice illustration that shows the effect of hormones and walks you through the steps in which this activation takes place. G proteins and hormone activity, as you can see, peptide hormones such as catecholamines and consinoids bind a membrane receptor. They will activate that G protein. 3 possible results can occur. Again, these are the steps. You can get an activation of the enzyme in the reaction, analyte cyclase, inhibition of analyte cyclase, and activation. And then you can also get other cofactors that are involved, such as phospholipase C. All of these are possible effects in carrying out, again, hormonal activity. Kinases are enzymes that are in this process. Generally, kinases are activated by the cyclic AMP. These phosphorylate proteins. The effect on the target cell, again, depends on the nature of the protein or the enzymes that are going to be affected. Phosphorylation of membrane proteins, for example, can open up calcium channels or ion channels. In the cytoplasm, many important enzymes can be activated by phosphorylation. You can see the following hormones: antidiuretic hormone, ACTH, epinephrine, FSH, LH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and glucagon all produce their effect by this mechanism of phosphorylation. The increase is usually short-lived. And again, as many hormones go, it can be short-lived, minutes to even shorter periods of time than that, because the cytoplasm contains another enzyme. And if you remember in AMP1, we talked about, those of you that are in AMP1, I guess this wouldn't hold true, but because you haven't had the muscle system yet, but there are enzymes. Acetylcholine is an enzyme that causes a particular effect on muscles. And then there's an enzyme that deactivates acetylcholine, acetylcholinesterase. So we see here in this process of phosphorylation, there's an enzyme, PDE, a phosphodiesterase, which inactivates cyclate AMP by converting it to AMP, and thus will make this process of phosphorylation very much short-lived. G proteins and calcium ions. Now, activated G protein can trigger the opening of calcium ion channels in the membrane. This releases calcium ions from intracellular stores. The step involves, shows the different steps, again, on this illustration. We've already talked about it, activation of the enzyme in both steps. And then in some cases, you have to inactivate the enzyme, and it's short-lived, again, because of the action of phosphodiesterase. Where's that at here? Phosphodiesterase will turn off the phosphorylation process and changing cyclic AMP to AMP. Those you don't have to know. Hormones and intracellular receptors. Now, some of the hormones react to intracellular receptors. There are cellular receptors that are on the cell membrane, but then there are some hormones that actually react to intracellular receptors. Steroid hormones are an example of this. They will diffuse across the lipid part of the cell membrane. Remember the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane, so they have to be lipid-soluble type structures to be able to diffuse across the membrane. It will bind to receptors that are located inside the cytoplasm or on the nucleus. The hormone receptor complexes then activate or deactivate specific genes. By this mechanism, steroid hormones can alter the rate of DNA transcription in the nucleus. We can see it change the pattern of protein synthesis. Thyroid hormones can also cross the cell membrane by diffusion or by a carrier mechanism, similar to what we talked about in AMP Part 1. Once inside the cytosol, the hormones will bind to specific receptors within the nucleus or, in some cases, on the mitochondria and carry out their effect. These are considered to be intracellular types of receptors. Now, the hypothalamus, the hypothalamic control center over the endocrine function. The hypothalamus secretes regulatory hormones, special hormones that control endocrine cells in the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus itself acts as an endocrine organ. Hypothalamic neurons synthesize specific hormones that transport them along the axon that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. That's referred to as the infundibulum. We see the release into circulation at the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. the two primary hormones that we talk about released from the pituitary lobe, from the posterior lobe pituitary gland, are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. That should be highlighted, but it will be highlighted later on in this lecture. The hypothalamus contains an autonomic system, autonomic center. Now, autonomic center means autonomic nervous system, intimately involved with the endocrine system that I'll go into a little bit later. But when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, it's broken up into two parts: a parasympathetic nervous system and a sympathetic nervous system. When we do the nervous system, you'll see how these two portions of the nervous system work together, but they make up the autonomic nervous system. This primarily is the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, especially as it relates to the adrenal medulla, where we see hormones such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine secreted into the bloodstream. This is just the anatomical regions of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. This illustration just kind of walks you through the regulatory hormones, where they work at. You've had some exposure to this because we talked about this in the reproductive system. We looked at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and how certain regulatory hormones were released to stimulate the release of specific hormones either in the anterior or posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, the neuroendocrine reflex, understand that the nervous system and the endocrine system work very closely together. The hypothalamus secretes regulatory hormones, and in the case of antidiuretic hormone, in response to changes in composition of circulating blood. We also see another hormone such as oxytocin, epinephrine, norepinephrine involve both a neural component, so the nervous system can stimulate the release of these hormones, or a hormonal mechanism. The adrenal medulla, for example, secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to specific action potentials from potential action. I had somebody one class, and I thought something was wrong with them, but they brought a dog, which I'm cool with that. They had a little dog in the purse, and the dog started barking or something, acting up. Who was in that micro class? Somebody's in there. Nobody's in that micro class. But anyway, this was just over the summer. So when I hear little noises, I wonder if I'm going to see somebody's pet boa come out or something. But anyway, sorry for those of you listening to the media. We digress for a moment. But getting back to the neuroendocrine reflex, the example I was given was in the adrenal medulla, where we see the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to action potentials from the nervous system, which will trigger the endocrine system to start working. These pathways are referred to as the neuroendocrine reflexes because they include both a neural component and an endocrine component. Now, again, we're at another highlighted segment which demonstrates to you how the both systems work. They rely on the release of chemicals that bind specific receptors on target cells, which we've already talked about. They share many chemical messengers. Epinephrine, norepinephrine are called hormones when released in the bloodstream, but they're called neurotransmitters when they work in the nervous system. And when we talk about the nervous system, you'll see we'll talk about epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine as neurotransmitters in the nervous system. But in the endocrine system, we're relating and we're talking about them as hormones. So they serve a dual role. We also see they're regulated primarily by a negative feedback mechanism. Remember, the negative feedback is a form of homeostasis. And then they share a common goal: preserve homeostasis by coordinating and regulating activity of cells and tissue and organ systems. Endocrine activity is controlled by endocrine reflexes, which are functionally counterparts of the neural reflex. They can be triggered by hormonal stimuli or neural stimuli. Now, the negative feedback mechanism, which you're already familiar with from AMP1, but just as a review, because I already know you know this, in most cases, endocrine reflexes are controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. Negative feedback stimulus triggers the production of a hormone whose direct or indirect effect then reduces the intensity of the stimulus. So, something stimulates or triggers the production of hormone. Hormone is produced out in the bloodstream, and when a certain level is reached, that hormone actually comes back and turns off the stimuli that actually causes secretion. When the hormone levels begin to fall, It decreases the inhibition of the steroid at the start of the system, and so more hormone starts to be secreted. This, in effect, this negative feedback mechanism helps to maintain homeostasis. Now, in a simple endocrine reflex, we're only talking about one hormone. Now, obviously, there are more complex mechanisms out there, but when we talk about the simple endocrine reflex, we're talking about one hormone. That one hormone can also cause this negative feedback mechanism. Examples of that are the effects or controls of hormones on tissue structures such as the heart, pancreas, parathyroid gland, digestive tract. The hypothalamus provides the highest level of endocrine control. It integrates the activity of both the nervous system and the endocrine system. And again, more complex endocrine reflexes involve one or more different types of hormones, may involve a number of intermediary steps as well, but certainly is much more complicated than what we see with a simple endocrine reflex. This is just an illustration out of your book. Just walks through quick steps of the hypothalamus releasing hormones, stimulating here the anterior pituitary gland, but we can also see its effect on the posterior pituitary gland, particular organ, endocrine organ, and then perhaps a second hormone, and then target cells that would respond. And this chart basically gives you the releasing hormone, the primary hormone that's produced, where the target, the endocrine target cell is at, and then the target organ where these hormones will cause their effect. And then this shows you how extensively the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the hormones that are produced by these organ systems diffusely affect the body. Again, this goes back to AMP1, where we said no system can function by itself without the support of the other systems. The only system that does not offer any support to other systems would be the reproductive system, so we can live without that. But all the other organ systems, as we can see, and certainly the reproductive system in itself, is affected by the hormones that are released by the endocrine system, either directly or indirectly. That's a nice picture to just give you a quick overview of all the systems. Now, the pituitary gland, also called the hypophysis. Can't remember if I asked you that question. You know, the hypophysis is just another name for the pituitary gland. I don't think I did. Did I say that in the review? No. Okay, so I didn't ask that. Okay, it hangs inferior to the hypothalamus. It is connected by the infundibulum. The selica turcica, which sits as a portion of the bony structure where the selica will sit, pituitary gland will sit in a little seat inside the skull, isolates it from the rest of the cranial cavity. Now, hormones are produced from different portions of the pituitary gland, anterior pituitary gland, posterior pituitary gland. There are primary hormones that you just need to be familiar with. When we talk about 7 hormones and those functions of the anterior pituitary gland, we're looking at TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, prolactin, GH, and melanin-stimulating hormone are all produced in the anterior portion of the pituitary gland. 6 hormones are produced by the pars distalis. 4 regulate the production of hormones in other endocrine glands. Growth hormones, one of these stimulates muscular and skeletal development, administered before the epiphyseal plates close. You know, bones grow from end to end. And so if you administer it before the epiphyseal plates close, then the person will grow taller. Okay? Now, if the plates are closed, which is the problem with the abuse of growth hormones, it does make your muscles stronger, does develop muscles, so it's one of those sports-enhancing drugs. You know, it's one of those sports-enhancing drugs. But if you administer it when the epiphyseal plates are closed, the bones thicken. They don't grow long anymore. They just thicken. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, remember back in AMP1, we talked about foramen, little tiny openings where nerves and blood vessels pass through. Well, as the bones thicken, those little foramen thicken too, and they close down, and it squeezes off the blood supply to the bone. And remember, the bones have to get blood supply. The problem with that is bones like the hip bone, which are major weight-bearing bones. If you cut off the blood supply to the hip bone, you get avascular necrosis. and you end up having to have hip replacements done. If you follow sports last several weeks, someone came out with a book and accused Bo. You remember Bo Jackson had to get both hips? You know Bo Jackson? Anybody know Bo Jackson? Some people are nodding their head. He was a football player. He played both sports, baseball and football. And he was a great athlete, but he had to stop because he got avascular necrosis. And so there was this suspicion that Bo Jackson had used growth hormone or some type of other hormone after the epiphyseal plates had closed, and it cut off the circulation to his hip, and he had to have it. He vehemently denied that. I don't know whether you believe that or not, but maybe he'll write a book like the other guy did. I don't know. But anyway, the point being, if you take growth hormone and the epiphyseal plates are closed, yes, you'll get stronger. Yes, you can run faster. But there are some long-term problems that are associated with the use of this medicine. That's a little off the subject, but we do talk a little bit about abuse of these types of substances later on. Acromegaly, is the excessive amount of growth hormone released after puberty when most of the epiphyseal cartilages have already closed. And so these individuals typically have very pronounced foreheads. They have very big body habitus, but it's more of a thickness than it is necessarily size. And it's the features of the bony structures that are prominent, much more so than the size. For example, the hands are typically very big and very thick. The feet, very big, very thick. Lower jaw usually protrudes out. The skull, very prominent. Clavicle bones, very thick, very prominent. Now, growth failures. Now, growth hormone is obviously used a lot in children now. Still a lot of debate and controversy about it, but children are unable to produce adequate amounts of concentration of growth hormone after pituitary growth. Can be administered growth hormone artificially. Current availability of purified human growth hormone has led to a lot of questions being asked ethically. Should we be manipulating a child's metabolism this way? I don't know which side of the coin you're on, but parents now really very closely monitor their child's growth on the growth curve. If they're a little bit below on their height, then a lot of parents will take them to an endocrinologist and request the administration of growth hormone to help with growth. Also has been praised as an anti-aging agent as well, a miracle cure, quote unquote. But remember, administration, even though it will increase and improve skin turgor, improve body skeletal muscle mass, there are some side effects, one of which, again, is the thickening of the bone, so you have to be cautious. But growth hormone supplements are being used as well. Anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, adenohypophysis. I didn't ask you that. I got it highlighted. Sure? Okay. Now, contains a variety of endocrine cells. Oh, I got it highlighted because this is where the parts of the anterior pituitary gland are. Pars distalis, pars tuberalis, and pars intermedialis, or intermediate. Now, in the circulatory system, there's an extensive capillary network that radiates through these regions, giving rise to endocrine cells, immediate access to the circulatory system. There are portal vessels and portal system, blood vessels that link the two capillary networks together. These are named because of their destination. The entire complex is referred to as the portal system. This is a circulatory network, and remember, hormones have direct access to the bloodstream. By secreting specific regulatory hormones, the hypothalamus controls the production of hormones in the anterior pituitary gland. Now, remember, hypothalamus typically produces the regulatory hormones, so the releasing hormones that we see produced there actually apply their effect on a pituitary gland, which will produce another set of hormones, which will then go to a target organ. This is just a slide out of your book. Shows you the circulatory system, the portal system of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now, the portal system, the entire complex, is referred to as the portal system. Portal system is named after the destination. This particular network is known as the hypophyseal portal system. Portal system provides an efficient means for chemical communication by ensuring that all the blood entering into the portal vessels can reach the intended target cells before it returns to the general circulation. Communication is strictly one way. some of the chemicals released in the cells move downstream. They must do so to make the complete tour of the circulatory system. And again, we have regulatory hormones, the two classes of hormones that are in the hypothalamus, one of which is the releasing hormone, and the other one is the inhibiting hormone. Releasing hormones stimulate the synthesis and secretion of one or more hormones in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, hypothalamus, pituitary gland. Then the inhibiting hormones prevents the synthesis and or secretion of hormones from the anterior lobe of the gland as well. Regulatory hormones are released at the hypothalamus or transported directly to the anterior lobe by the hypophyseal portal system. And again, this is the illustration that I showed you earlier, just showing you and demonstrating to you the different releasing hormones and the hormones that are stimulated from the pituitary gland and then their subsequent target organs. There's a feedback control in endocrine secretion that we've already talked about before. Again, this helps to maintain homeostasis. For example, regulation of prolactin, production from the anterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus produces a releasing factor, prolactin releasing factor, then an inhibiting hormone. Prolactin inhibiting hormone is then produced. When one is stimulated, the other one is inhibited. This again helps to maintain homeostasis. Similar regulation of growth hormone is seen. Again, a stimulating hormone and an inhibiting, if I can say it, an inhibiting hormone is produced as well. Now, these are 7 major hormones that are produced in the anterior portion of the pituitary gland that I've already alluded to. TSH, ACTH, follicle-stimulating hormone, LH, prolactin, growth hormone, melanin-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, thyrotropin, targets the thyroid gland and triggers the release of thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, known as corticotropin, stimulates the release of certain steroid hormones by the adrenal cortex. Remember, the adrenal gland is located above the kidneys. The outer portion of the adrenal gland is the cortex. ACTH stimulates target cells that produce glucocorticoids, or hormones that affect glucose metabolism. We'll also see hormones secreted out of the pancreas as well that will affect glucose metabolism as well. The gonadotrophins stimulated by follicle-stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormones. The gonadotrophins, because they regulate the activities of the gonads. We went into a lot of detail about this during the reproductive system, so I won't go into a lot of detail about it now, but basically this is where we see the effect of the sexual hormones on the body. Productions of gonadotrophins are related to the releasing hormones, gonadotrophin releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. Follicle-stimulating hormone, estradiol, one of those hormones produced, which is important as a source of estrogen. In males, we see follicle-stimulating hormones will stimulate the substenacular cells. I know you guys remember this from last semester. Helps specialized cells in the tubules, helps sperm to differentiate and to mature. Luteinizing hormone also induces ovulation and production of reproductive cells. We see that the sex hormones called androgens, most important of which is testosterone in males, LH production like FSH production, similar to gonadotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Prolactin and prolactin inhibiting hormone. Prolactin works as other hormones to stimulate mammary gland production, very important during pregnancy, where we need prolactin to help stimulate milk production in the mammary glands. Prolactin production also can be inhibited by prolactin inhibiting hormone. This is also similar to neurotransmitter of dopamine. Some other key gonadotrophins, prolactin, estrogen, progesterone, glucocorticoid, pancreatic hormones, and hormones produced by the placenta cooperate in preparing the mammary gland for the production of milk. So we can see this is more of a complex endocrine process, as I talked about just a little bit earlier. Growth hormone, again, or somatotropin, another hormone that stimulates an effect on target cells, cell growth, replication, acceleration of protein synthesis. Virtually every tissue to some degree will respond to this hormone. Skeletal muscle cells, particularly, and bone cells and cartilage cells, also very sensitive to growth hormone. Stimulation by growth hormone involves several mechanisms. Two primary ones, and one which is indirect. Liver cells respond to the presence of growth hormone by synthesizing and releasing somatomedins. These are insulin-like growth factors, which they're basically peptide hormones, which will help bind particular receptor sites at a variety of cell membranes. Again, with the adequate amount of cell membranes, and especially if we get the upregulation of receptor sites on these cell membranes, it's even more of an intense effect from growth hormones on particular cells. So we see skeletal muscle fibers, cartilage cells, and other target cells increase the rate of uptake of amino acid and incorporation of new proteins. The effects develops almost immediately after growth hormone has been released, particularly important after a meal when the blood contains higher concentrations of glucose and particular amino acids. Growth hormone also, we see, will stimulate the breakdown of stored triglycerides by adipocytes or fat cells. Circulating fatty acid levels in many tissue will stop breaking down glucose and start breaking down fatty acids and ATP. This helps break down fat, increase lean muscle mass. Again, a big effect of growth hormone and why many world-class athletes like to use and abuse. Growth hormone in the liver. Growth hormone stimulates the breakdown of glycogen reserves in the liver, which increases glucose in the bloodstream. Because most of the tissue is now metabolizing fatty acids rather than glucose, we'll see blood glucose concentrations begin to climb, perhaps a level significantly higher than normal. Another effect, this is called a diabetogenic effect. I'm not testing you on that, but I think it's important for you to recognize, especially with the use of these agents out in the system, some of the side effects and perhaps even a long-term side effect. Again, an agent that is going to persistently increase the amount or elevate glucose levels that leads to a diabetogenic type of an effect. Because diabetes mellitus is an endocrine disorder, I think it's important to consider that, at least discuss it as a part of this process. Now, another hormone, melanin-stimulating hormone, produced in the pars intermediate. This secretes two forms of melanin, or melanotrophin. As the name indicates, it helps stimulate melanocytes in the skin, increasing the production of melanin, which is a brown and or black or yellow-brown pigment that's in the body. The release of MSH can be inhibited by dopamine. Melanocyte-stimulating hormone is important to control skin pigmentation. We see the pars intermediate in adult humans is virtually non-functional, and the circulating blood usually does not contain any melanocyte-stimulating hormone. Secreted by the pars intermediate during fetal development, very young children, pregnant women, and in some diseases. Functional significance is really not known, but the administration of synthetic forms of melanocyte-stimulating hormone causes the skin to darken. So MSH has been suggested as a mean of getting a suntan without actually being exposed to the sun. I don't think they quite have that down yet, though, so I wouldn't take any experimental treatment with that at this point. Growth hormone stimulates muscle and skeletal development. Again, given at the wrong period of time, if you give it after the epiphyseal joints have closed, then the person will increase the thickness of the muscle mass, will increase the thickness of the bone, but it potentially would not cause any increase in height. That's where the condition acromegaly will occur, and or it can be induced, iatrogenically induced acromegaly when you've been administering growth hormone for these individuals. We've already talked about that. Control of endocrine activity, endocrine reflex, we already talked about. Negative feedback, simple endocrine reflex, we've already talked about. Secreted hormones adjust activity of target cells and restores homeostasis. The simple endocrine reflex, again, we've already talked about, involves one hormone. I've already shown you this illustration. 3 methods of hypothalamic control. Again, because of the releasing hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus secretes certain regulatory hormones, special hormones that control endocrine cells. The hypothalamus regulatory hormones control secretory activities by endocrine cells in the anterior lobe and to a degree the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland as well, but there is a neurological impact into the posterior lobe as well. The hormones released by the anterior lobe in turn control activities of endocrine cells in thyroid gland, adrenal gland, and in reproductive gland. And this is all pretty much just a review of what we've talked about before. Now, the example for the simple endocrine reflex is a hormone insulin. In the simple endocrine reflex, hormones are released continuously, but the rate of secretion may rise or fall in response to the stimuli. So we see blood glucose levels climb. The pancreas secretion of insulin will occur, a hormone that stimulates glucose absorption and utilization. Remember, when glucose is produced in the system, whether we take it in diet and it's broken down and then made available, or whether in starvation cases the system breaks down glycogen, makes more glucose available in the system, either way, insulin is required to take the sugar, to take the glucose from outside the red blood cell into the red blood cell. Without insulin, sugar remains in the circulation, which doesn't do the cell any good. The cell has to have it inside for it to be able to work. Insulin levels rise, glucose levels will decline because insulin takes the glucose out of the circulation and brings it inside the cell. Stimulation of insulin secreting cells will then be reduced. As glucose levels return back to normal, the rate of insulin secretion reaches a resting level. That's a simple endocrine reflex. Now, pulse effect. Another test question was about the pulse effect. So there are some examples where responses of particular target cells can change over time because the impact of, say, insulin, for example, is proportional to concentrations of glucose that are available. Relationship between hormone concentration and target cell response cannot always be predictable like we see in the mechanism of insulin in response to glucose. This is an example where a hormone has one effect at low concentrations and then maybe an additional effect or even a different effect altogether at much higher concentrations. So several hormones in the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are released in sudden bursts. These bursts are referred to as pulses rather than continuously. When the hormones arrive in a pulse, the target cell may vary in their response and in the frequency of the response. Target cells' responses to one pulse every 3 hours are different from the responses that you may see if it arrives every 30 minutes, or that you may see if the hormone is secreted at a much lower level on a more continuous basis. The most complicated hormonal instruction is issued by the hypothalamus and involves changes in the frequency of these pulses and the amount secreted by each pulse. Now, the other part of the pituitary gland is the posterior lobe. Posterior lobe of the pituitary gland called the neurohypophysis. Again, this is the pars nervosus. And remember, the posterior portion has more of a neurological impact. Nervous system stimulates that more. We see the posterior lobe produces two hormones. You need to know this, highlighted: antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Primary function of antidiuretic hormone is to decrease the amount of water loss in the kidneys, so the target cells are going to be in the kidneys. Antidiuretic hormone primarily is going to act on the kidney tubules. Antidiuretic hormone release is inhibited by alcohol. You drink beer, you got to pee a lot because alcohol inhibits antidiuretic hormone. So we can see alcohol. Now there are some other drugs. That's the most common one that we see that inhibits antidiuretic hormone. Explains the increased fluid excretion following the consumption of alcoholic beverages. I shouldn't use the word pee according to my mother. Say urinate or say the increased fluid excretion. Yes. Okay. Another condition called diabetic insipidus. Again, you'll get this when you take pathology, and so I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but diabetes insipidus, not like diabetes mellitus that we talk about with glucose control. Diabetes insipidus generally develops because the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland no longer releases an adequate amount of antidiuretic hormone. If you don't produce enough antidiuretic hormone, then you diurese. And so these individuals are constantly releasing, excreting fluid. And so water conservation at the kidneys is impaired. Excessive amounts of water are lost through the urine. The other hormone released from the posterior aspect of the pituitary gland, oxytocin, stimulates smooth muscle tissues of the walls of the uterus, promoting labor and delivery. When a woman is delivering a baby, we see oxytocin is being released. Actually stimulates the contraction of smooth muscle, particularly in the uterus, but also can contract the smooth muscles in the breast as well. And so many times, if oxytocin levels have been stimulated, you also see secretion of milk as well from the mammary glands because of the secretion of oxytocin. Also, when a mother starts breastfeeding and she hears the baby crying, there's a neuroendocrine reflex that the mother will start lactating in response to the baby crying. No. Also, during orgasm as well, oxytocin is released. The uterine contracts, also causes the myoepithelial muscles in the breast tissue to release milk as well. So several different mechanisms can cause the secretion of